There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for joining our presser on Climate Autumn, the suite of climate policies that are in development this fall, what's going on with them, why they matter, what's coming up, what you should be paying attention to. My name is Vicky. I'm communications lead for Climate Action Network Canada. And I'll be introducing folks and then handing it over. So our plans for today, we're going to be talking about the analysis of the climate policies and then open up the space for discussion. Just for some context, this is the first of 2 different briefings that we're going to be holding. So next week, there will be another press briefing that's kind of explicitly focused on COP27, the international negotiations side of things, what Canada's role will be there. But today's conversation is going to be the other side of the coin, really. Many of the policy areas that we're talking about are linked to promises that Canada has made at previous COPs. And so the discussion is going to be focusing on how we're actually implementing those commitments at the domestic level. So each panelist is going to speak for about 5 minutes. We have my colleague Brouillette with Climate Action Network, who will be talking about the general framing and context for this moment and the need for Canada to enhance its climate ambition ahead of COP27. We have Hyder, who will be talking about the emissions cap on the oil and gas sector from environmental defense. Binnu Jeyakumar, who will be talking about the clean electricity standard from the Pembina Institute. Vanessa Corkal from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, who will be discussing just transition legislation. Émile Boisseau-Bouvier from Équiterre about the need to end fossil fuel subsidies. And finally, Tom Green from David Suzuki Foundation on zero emissions vehicle standards. So obviously lots of folks here and lots to cover today. At the end of that, we'll open the floor for questions and we'll hopefully get into some interesting discussion. There is unfortunately not simultaneous interpretation today, but some of our panelists are bilingual. Caro and Émile, of course, and Tom and Vanessa are all happy to take questions in French. And as you would have seen and heard, this is all being recorded and it's also all on the record. We're expecting that this will mostly be helpful for background information. We're not really expecting climate policy nerds talk about climate policy to be a big news headline, but you are welcome to use this information in any way that you see fit. And afterwards, I'll send out a link to the recording with contact information for all the panelists. Those are all the housekeeping notes that I have, so I'll pass it over to the folks that you came to actually listen to today. Over to you, Caro.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Although we're all gathering virtually, I'm talking to you today from Jajage unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory in what is currently known as Montréal. Je vois qu'on a quelques journalistes francophones avec nous également aujourd'hui, donc bienvenue, merci d'être là. Habituellement, on est capable d'avoir de l'interprétation, ça n'a pas été possible cette fois-ci, donc on vous remercie vraiment de votre compréhension. Et on va prendre les questions en français comme Vicky a dit. So as we all heard on Tuesday during the conversation between journalist Akshat Rathi and the Prime Minister, 7 years into 3 mandates, this government has yet to deliver any sustained emissions reductions. Indeed, as G7 countries, emissions have declined since the signing of the Paris Agreement, Canada's emissions are still plateauing. More than 6 months ago, Environment and Climate Change Minister Stephen Guilbeault released an emissions reduction plan. On Tuesday, we heard Prime Minister Trudeau declare that because of the plan this time, unlike all previous climate goals, Canada would meet its target of cutting emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. But the plan largely rests on policies that are still in development, and the devil is always in the details. Whether the policies this government is developing over the next few months are strong and rigorous enough could make or break our chance of success. And we know that the fossil fuel industry is lobbying hard for exemptions and loopholes. We're also in a very particular moment of intersecting crises. The high level of inflation we're seeing right now, driven by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the climate crisis are not separate events. In fact, inflation driven by a high oil price, makes reducing our dependence on volatile fuels and accelerating the shift to energy efficiency and renewables all the more urgent. You don't have to take my word for it. Christine Lagarde, chair of the European Central Bank, called what's going on fossilflation. Oil and gas companies are raking in record profits while Canadians are realizing how vulnerable their wallets are to these volatile fuels. Nearly half of Canadians looking to buy a car right now are looking for an electric vehicle. And with oil and gas being the largest drivers of consumer price increases, investing in electrification and renewables is a no-brainer, and you'll hear more about how regulation can drive this from my esteemed co-panelists. Now, not to preclude the second part of this conversation, of this briefing that Vicky mentioned we'll be hosting next week, but COP27 is an implementation COP. That means that after the flurry of announcements in Glasgow, in Sharm el-Sheikh, parties are expected to deliver. In the Canadian context, that means ensuring we are accountable both to commitments under the Glasgow Climate Pact and the Paris Agreement, but also on our very own, under our very own net zero emissions accountability legislation. Unfortunately, our current emissions reduction plan does not actually show how Canada will meet its climate target. As currently written, it also fails in several ways to meet the requirements set in the Act. In November last year, the world gathered to reckon with the reality that countries' current climate pledges fall short of adding up to the emissions cuts needed to ensure that global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, instead putting the world on track for a disastrous 2.7 degrees. The Glasgow Climate Pact, signed by all parties, including Canada, urged countries to strengthen their pledges by the end of 2022. And Climate Action Network Canada evaluates that for the country to do its fair share of global climate action of this effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, Canada must reduce its emissions domestically by at least 60% below 2005 levels by 2030. So there's a simple solution to this, which is strengthening our nationally determined contribution, or NDC, and the emissions reductions plan, or ERP, ahead of COP27. Canada can show leadership here and lead the global charge, as it is its responsibility as a top 10 emitter, both in absolute numbers and per capita terms. The enhanced plan must also announce how it will implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples seriously, and how emissions reduction solutions across economic sectors will not impede on Indigenous rights and sovereignty. I will now let my amazing co-panelists tell you more about 6 other key pieces of policy for which the implementation and design are key to this climate success we're discussing today. So I will hand the virtual microphone to Hyder at Environmental Defense.
Thanks, Carol. Hi, folks. I'm speaking from Ottawa, on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I'll be speaking to the emissions cap, the oil and gas emissions cap policy. Last year at COP26, Prime Minister Trudeau committed to cap oil and gas emissions at a pace and scale needed to get us to net zero by 2050. A timely announcement, as the oil and gas sector being the largest source of pollution in Canada and accounting for 26% of our domestic emissions, continues to rise at an alarming rate. The sector has increased its emissions by 89% since 1990, and more recently by 20% since 2005. The current federal government has a real opportunity for once and for all, limit and reduce oil and gas emissions in a meaningful way. But to do so, it has to take bold action right now. As you heard Carol mention, with the COP coming up in 2 weeks' time, we are looking for the Prime Minister to follow through on his promise that he made last year and announce the specific targets that his government will implement for the oil and gas emissions cap policy. Recently, we have seen climate catastrophes continue to increase in intensity and frequency. And for Canada, that means that the only way that we have to mitigate against future catastrophes is by addressing the oil and gas emissions. And without having clear interim targets set, specifically for 2026 and 2030, the chances of this emissions cap policy actually reducing the oil and gas emissions to the levels that we need for Canada to achieve its climate commitments are slim to none. Research shows that the most cost-effective way that we have for Canada to meet its climate commitments would be to act urgently in the short term and follow that up with a strong long-term plan. Along with that, Canadians across the country are looking for a strong emissions cap. A recent Abacus poll shows that 7 out of 10 Canadians want the industry to take on their fair share of climate responsibility. On top of that, thousands upon thousands of Canadians have signed letters to the ministers asking for them to implement a strong emissions cap as well. As you heard Carol mention, for a country like Canada, a wealthy and a high emitting country, the fair share for emissions reductions would be 60% across all sectors by 2030. Now, of course, the oil and gas sector has to meet the same mark as well to avoid straining other sectors with undue pressures of additional emissions reductions. Anything less than 60% would not only just lower the chances of keeping global temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, but it would also require additional efforts for countries in the global south, countries that have not contributed to climate change to the same extent as the global north countries, but yet face more intense and more frequent climate catastrophes. We know that time is of the essence with this policy. We are seeing the oil and gas industry and its lobby groups hard at work to delay and weaken this policy before it is even implemented. And they still continue to fester doubt and spread misinformation in the public eye. Which is, of course, nothing new, as we have seen for decades this industry continue to weaken and fight tooth and nail against any proposed climate action. But in the case of this policy, we're seeing the industry ask for more delays, more loopholes, and more subsidies when it comes to speculative technologies like carbon capture and storage that have time and time again proven unsuccessful, costly, and unscalable. On Tuesday, at the Canadian Climate Institute's conference in Ottawa, Prime Minister Trudeau guaranteed that after years of not being able to successfully reduce its emissions, Canada would finally meet its target by 2030. And Minister Guilbeault said that it is only a matter of months before the emissions cap policy is drafted. What we need to now look out for is how ambitious this emissions cap policy is. Will this proposed policy consider Canada's fair share responsibility and hold the industry accountable? Will we show that Canada is not only just talking the talk, but is willing and able to walk the walk as well? Or will this be a toothless and weak policy that fails to make a dent in the ever-growing pollution from the industry? Prime Minister Trudeau and his government can dispel these concerns by announcing a strong, ambitious 2026 and 2030 target for the emissions cap policy by COP27. Now I'll pass it over to Binnu Jeyakumar to speak on the clean electricity standard.
Thanks, Ali. Hello, folks. I'm Binnu Jeyakumar, director of the Pembina Institute. I'm usually based in Alberta, but today I'm dialing in from New York City, homeland to the Lenape people. So picking up on what Ali was talking about, the COP26 commitments that Prime Minister Trudeau made, one of the other things Prime Minister Trudeau also announced in Glasgow was a commitment to get Canada to a net zero grid by 2035. That actually brings our electricity sector ambition in step with our US neighbors. It's also a critical step for all OECD countries to take in order to meet that 1.5 degree goal we set in Paris. In addition, a clean grid is also critical to maintaining affordability. So Carol mentioned all the volatility in gas prices that are right now happening worldwide. And there's a need for us to decouple our grid from the commodity price of gas by going clean. The other advantage of a clean grid is also we can attract more investments into Canada. This is an economic issue too, as more and more companies have environmental sustainability and governance goals that are more and more ambitious. The other thing is also for getting to a net economy by 2050, a clean grid will form the backbone for it. As industries, buildings, and transportation start to decarbonize, a lot of them are using electrification as their primary pathway. And so it becomes increasingly more important that we have a clean grid. Now, the most significant policy to enable a clean grid in Canada is actually the Clean Electricity Regulation. And that's currently under development. The way this regulation is being designed is it aims to put limits on the emission intensity of power plants. So that's the amount of carbon emissions they can emit for every unit of energy that they produce. This policy actually has a lot of potential. If it is successful, it'll help disincentivize investments in unnecessary new gas and reduce our dependence on gas for the electricity sector. If it's designed really well, it could even incentivize investments in much needed carbon removal technologies that are going to become really critical in a net zero economy. The challenge, however, is that there are too many flexibilities and loopholes right now being added to the regulation. And we understand that the regulation needs to be practical, and there are some flexibilities that are required. However, there are sort of three main issues I wanted to touch on that prevent us from achieving a credible net zero grid by 2035. The first is the policy as it's being designed right now doesn't have any interim standards, and the standard that they're proposing won't apply until 2035. This leaves open a risk for significant new gas development, and it's a risk we can't afford, as these plants can become stranded assets in a clean grid, and then they'll become a liability to us as ratepayers and taxpayers. The second issue is that existing gas plants could potentially be allowed to operate well beyond 2035 without any emissions mitigation. Again, we understand there's a need for some flexibility, but extending gas plant operation much beyond 2035 means you could have still significant emissions on the electricity grid. The third thing I wanted to mention is that, this is the definition of what net zero means. So we understand there will be some emissions on the grid. How do you negate them? That mechanism hasn't yet been designed. And there's a risk that some of the mechanisms that are on the table could just be monetary payments that don't actually result in credible and permanent emission reduction. The fix, we think, are four things. The first is to set interim standards, to set a clear and immediate goal to incentivize any new gas investments that are on the horizon. The second thing would be to ensure that existing gas plants are not allowed to operate without any mitigation past 2035, with very few exceptions. The third thing would be to ensure that any residual emissions are addressed through credible and permanent emission reductions. So these are offsets like direct air capture. And the last thing I would say is, I know affordability is on people's mind a lot right now, and it's being used as an excuse to dilute the CER. But our position is that there should be other complementary measures that are used to address those concerns, rather than by reducing the efficacy of the CER. So there are prudent investments that the federal government can make in partnership with the provinces for low-income households, energy efficiency, transmission interconnections, and all of those measures can actually help bring down the cost of transition. And I'd say this is even more urgent for us right now, especially in light of the Inflation Reduction Act that the US has. So what are we expecting to happen right now that you can keep your eyes out for is the first draft of the regulation should be coming out sometime around Christmas this year and will be published in Canada Gazette. We will also be looking to see what comes out in the next federal budget in terms of commitments to the electricity grid and for addressing affordability issues. And the last thing I want to mention is this is stuff happening behind the scenes a little bit, but the federal government is starting to initiate conversations with provinces through regional energy tables. And I think that holds a lot of potential to design solutions that actually work for specific provinces and to get federal and provincial governments to work together. So that's something we'll be also looking at for. And with that, I'll pass it over to Vanessa Corkal to speak on just transition.
Thank you so much, Binnu. Nice to see everyone, especially some of you that I saw earlier this week at the CCI NZAB event. So just to kind of set the context on just transition, we don't actually have many just transition policies that actually have been passed yet. So we're going to be talking today about what we're looking to see on that. But first, I want to acknowledge that the work on this file is heavily influenced by our work in partnership with union and labor partners, and that in fact, Climate Action Network Canada is the only Climate Action Network branch in the world that has union membership, which is really exciting. And you can hear some of those labor members directly at a webinar we're hosting on Just Transition next week. If you want to hear that directly, I'll put that in the chat if you want to register. But what this boils down to is that Canada needs a plan for those workers and communities that are currently reliant on carbon-intensive industries. We don't actually have a plan for those workers. The federal emissions reduction plan doesn't lay out a plan for the future of those workers. And we know that there's a lot of increasing pressures on workers from increased automation, impacts to high carbon industries. We know as many as 56,000 new jobs must be created to enable those workers to transition. And not having a clear plan means that those workers and communities have an uncertain future, and we also create risks depriving them of the economic opportunities that the low carbon transition presents. So as we're supporting workers that are impacted, we also have a huge opportunity to create opportunities for everyone to take part in the new economy and create decent, fair, and high value work for all. That includes prioritizing the needs of Indigenous communities and marginalized communities who have previously not been able to fully participate in the economy. So what this policy would do is there's a few different components. There's the Just Transition legislation that was promised in 2019, a Just Transition strategy that would be comprehensive across government, and then alongside that, we need funding to make it all happen. So what legislation would do would be to outline the government's role in supporting workers during the transition, entrench principles for the government's approach, and it would also establish capacity within government to actually implement some of those measures. And most importantly, create accountability for planning, especially for regional and sectoral transitions. So because we need to understand where we're going, we need to understand how different regions and different sectors are going to be impacted, and then create transition plans that are geographically and sectorally specific. So that is a really important component of a broader just transition strategy, which would provide certainty to workers about their economic future and would also help industry to plan. You might wonder, what is the difference between this and the regional energy and resource roundtables that are underway? The main difference is that just transition requires a comprehensive national approach and requires workers and impact communities to be directly at the table in what we call social dialogue, or a tripartite plus approach, to use the jargon. So that is inherently different from the roundtable approach, which is really happening province by province. This conversation needs to translate local concerns to national strategy and have mechanisms to support workers and communities as they transition. So what the problem right now is that we have a major delay in the legislation. It was first promised in 2019. We don't actually have a draft of that legislation yet. Ideally, that would have been passed alongside the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. We have a poor track record on this. The Task Force for Coal Power Workers and Communities, many of the recommendations were not actually passed and funded. And that was, several thousand workers, and we're looking at potentially a much higher number of workers that are going to be impacted as our economy rapidly starts to transition. There's also risks of Canada not abiding by international standards. So we have commitments internationally under the Paris Agreement, the Silesia Declaration, as well as our commitments under the International Labour Organization's guidelines for just transition that we need to see Canada abide by. And historically, it's been underfunded as well. So we have the $2 billion Futures Fund, which is a good start. We have some money for training, but we really need to be able to have funding that is proactive, flexible, nationally coordinated, and supports local decision-making, and it is scaled to what we need to actually see. So this fall, we'll be looking for a few different things. The first is the What We Heard report from government, which are the results of the consultations that Natural Resources Canada did on just transition from fall 2021 to spring of this year. We'll also be looking at fall or potentially early 2023 for an interim just transition strategy. So that's also being led by Natural Resources Canada. We don't know when to expect it. We know that it's in the works. And alongside that, sometime next year, the creation of an advisory body that would oversee the work that government is doing, And of course, hopefully in the first quarter of 2023, tabling of the legislation. So what we are looking for in that legislation specifically are a few different things. We're looking for principles that are grounded in international best practice. We're looking for a dedicated government institution to actually have the capacity to implement the policies, a mechanism to enable regional and sectoral planning, ways to center Indigenous rights in the legislation, because we need to protect and advance Indigenous treaty rights and UNDRIP alignment within that legislation, and planning and reporting requirements to ensure accountability. So just to say that overall, it's a complex file. There's a lot of different pieces, but that ultimately this is one part of one building block of a broader and comprehensive approach to ensure a transition, and that in addition to these specific policy pieces, we also need to see from government things like green industrial policy, labor market planning and adjustment, and upholding of the polluter pays principles to ensure that workers benefit and are not negatively impacted by the transition. So for now, I will pass it to Émile Boisseau-Bouvier from Équiterre to talk about subsidies.
Bonjour à tous, Émile Boisseau-Bouvier, analyste des politiques climatiques chez Hyder. Je vis et je travaille à Jojage, aussi connu sous le nom de Montréal, and I'll be talking about fossil fuel subsidies and public financing today. So both the International Energy Agency and the IPCC were very clear that we should have no further investments in any kind of fossil fuel starting now if we want to stay on a path that is below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That being said, Canada remains a large provider of fossil fuel subsidies. In 2021, federal fossil fuel subsidies totaled at least $8.6 billion, including direct transfers, foregone tax revenues, as well as public financing, such as through Economic Development Canada. As of now, in 2022, it's at least $15.5 billion, including a $10 billion loan guarantee to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Canada also remains the largest provider of public finance to fossil fuels, with an average of $11 billion per year between 2018 and 2020. That is 14.5 times more public financing than for renewable energy. Thankfully, Canada committed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies in 2023. And during COP26 last year, it also joined a historic commitment to stop providing public finance for fossil fuel projects abroad and prioritize support for clean energy by the end of 2022. Basically, we have a lot of work to do in a very short period of time, and it is for the greatest cause. So why does it matter? Well, Canada has to stop being both the fireman and the arsonist. We have to align our fiscal policies and our climate policies. Subsidies and public financing artificially reduce the price of fossil fuel projects and thus undermine the competitiveness of renewable alternatives. We also know that Canada has a limited budget spend, so this can be a way of cutting into Canada's expenses. Canada needs to start supporting the good habits and not the bad ones, because if not, we risk locking the country into a fossil path. We risk to finance projects that will eventually become stranded assets, just as the Trans Mountain Pipeline may well be. And we don't help communities and workers who are still depending on fossil fuels. We put them under artificial respiratory systems. We need to, as Vanessa said, plan the transition with them starting now, not continue in the same old habits. So what do we need to meet these commitments? Well, we need to know what is a fossil fuel subsidy. We need to know what is an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy. And we need to know how much subsidies and public financing there is in Canada as well. So one key thing to have those answers is completing the G20 peer review with Argentina that is far behind schedule. Basically, each country review the other's fossil fuel subsidies. This needs to be done transparently. It needs to be done using internationally agreed World Trade Organization definitions. And we need to have a clear and robust criteria for efficiency. ISD and Équiterre, we published a policy brief this summer to define inefficiency in the Canadian context. If Canada doesn't have an ambitious peer review, it will not be internationally credible, and we won't have the information to actually meet our pledges. So this peer review is crucial for the government to quickly develop a plan to end fossil fuel financing, including through crown corporations such as EDC, Export Development Canada. We also need to stop introducing new fossil fuel subsidies. As Ali mentioned, we need to close loopholes that allow subsidies for and public financing for carbon capture and storage for the oil and gas sector. We need to close the loopholes for blue hydrogen as well, blue hydrogen being hydrogen derived from fossil gas. And we should not, the government of Canada should not pay for the environmental cleanup that the companies are responsible for. We should apply the polluter pays principle. So for that, we need to ensure that there are robust green strengths and climate conditions that are attached to the federal spending programs, such as the Net Zero Accelerator found. And so there's a big risk with 23 being right around the corner, literally, there's a big risk of missing our timeline. So Canada has not done a lot, but has a lot on its table, and we want to see them deliver this fall and during the next years to come. That being said, I'll hand the virtual mic to Tom that will talk about the zero emission vehicle standards.
Yeah, thanks, Émile, and good to be here with you today. And I'm talking to you from a very, very smoky Vancouver, and we're going to get our first rain in such a long time tomorrow, so I'm very excited about that. So what's a zero emission vehicle standard? It does two critical things. First, it will help Canada reach its 2030 target of 60% zero emission vehicles and 100% by 2035. Second, it will help make zero emission vehicles more affordable and ensures that they're going to be available on dealers' lots from coast to coast, because right now, most of them are available in BC and Quebec and very hard to find in Atlantic Canada or Alberta and Saskatchewan. And these policies are proven. It's a policy that was developed by California, and it's used in California in 15 states and also in British Columbia and Quebec to increase zero emission vehicle supply or EV supply. So why does this matter? Transportation is 24% of Canada's emissions, so it's the second largest piece of the pie after oil and gas. And of that, half that 24% comes from passenger vehicles. And between 2005 and 2019, despite vehicle emission standards, GHG emissions from the light duty fleet increased by 7.5%. And that's partly because Canadians have been buying SUVs and largely because manufacturers have really been promoting big vehicles because that's where they make their most profits. Now, 74% of Canadians think that auto manufacturers have a responsibility to shift to zero emission vehicles. That poll was released in September 2022. And if we compare ourselves internationally, in 2021, Germany was already at 25% EV share of new vehicle sales. Norway was at 86%. EU-wide was 17%, and Canada was at a mere 5.5%, so really lagging. So countries with great EV sales have either stringent vehicle emission standards or they have a ZEV standard. Not only that, Canada is lagging in EV manufacturing investments, so we're missing out on a big opportunity. And we've tried the voluntary approach, which industry prefers, and industry has not delivered. Meanwhile, in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act is spurring EV manufacturing and adoption and risks sucking further the EVs from the Canadian market. And we have cross-party consensus on this one. In April 2021, the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development recommended a ZEV standard. So just getting a bit more into the problem, 55% of dealers didn't have a single zero emission vehicle on their lots. So Canadians can't buy them. Waiting lists of 3 months to 3 years for many EV models. And as mentioned, the vehicles aren't being supplied evenly across Canada. They're going to where there are standards. And so they're 7 to 10 times more available per capita in BC and Quebec than they are in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And automakers are making money selling big guzzling EVs, and they've delayed investing in EV manufacturing, even though they've known this was coming. I've worked on the EV file since I first got to the foundation almost exactly 5 years ago. And Canadian dealers won't be forced to sell EVs if they don't want to, and Canadian consumers won't be forced to buy them under a ZEV standard. The industry is trying to create some confusion there. But there will be penalties if companies don't supply a sufficient proportion. So how do we fix this problem? With a strong federal ZEV standard, each year auto manufacturers would need to sell an increasing proportion of EVs. If they sell more than they needed, they have credits which they can trade with other companies that may be lagging in their manufacturing. Or they can pay the penalty for not having enough EVs. Another approach that industry prefers is that we triple the incentive that's available for Canadians to buy EVs. That would be incredibly expensive to the public purse. And actually what it's likely to do is just have manufacturers increase their prices for EVs and capture more of that money. So what to watch for next? We're hoping for a draft ZEV standard by the end of the year, being published in Canada Gazette 1. Maybe that'll bleed over to 2023, but by the end of 2023, we should have the final standard in place, and first-year companies will have to meet the standard will be 2024. So that's it from me. I'll pass it over to Caroline Brouillette, and I will also just put a few links in the chat.
Thank you so much, Tom, Binnu, Vanessa, Ali, and Émile. We really want to quickly hand it over to our journalists, guests for questions, but there's just another important piece of policy that I want to mention that is key to Canada doing its part of global climate justice, because climate justice is about reducing our emissions, but also about how we care for each other in a context where climate impacts are accelerating in intensity and frequency. The federal government currently is aiming to create a program that will provide a path to permanent residency for up to 500,000 immigrants who are working in Canada but do not have a status. Climate Action Network Canada urges the government to fulfill this promise of creating a regularization program and a program expanding pathways to permanent residency in the most comprehensive and inclusive way, leaving no one behind, which means giving equal rights to all migrants. So we're proud to fully support Migrant Rights Network's recommendations for this regularization program. Migrant justice, is climate justice. Hand it over back to Vicky.
Thanks so much, Caro, and thanks so much to all the panelists for your really great insights into these different pieces. And apologies to the journalists on the line. We've gone a little bit over time with what we wanted to do before opening it up to questions, but as you can tell, there's quite a bit to cover. So at this point, feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, put a star in the chat, and happy to get into some discussion here.
Yeah, sure. This is Amanda Stevenson with the Canadian Press. I've got a question related to the oil and gas sector emissions cap. So, Ali, were you saying that this cap, you used the 60% figure. Is that how high you think that this cap should actually go? Because I know that the federal government had previously stated it believes the oil patch is capable of getting to, I think, 42% below 2019 levels by 2030.
Right. Yes. So you heard that right. I do believe, and it's not just me, of course, analysis by folks here at Climate Action Network did an in-depth analysis to consider basically what our Canada's fair share responsibility is. As I mentioned, as a rich, resourceful country, as a high emitting country, we have a certain responsibility when it comes to global setting, when it comes to emissions reductions, because not every country has played an equal role in climate change and the impacts or the actions that have increased climate change. So 60% for domestic reductions is a sector-wide ask when we're talking about what would be the fair share responsibility. And to that end, if it's fair share, every sector within the country should also be able to meet that reduction, which includes, oil and gas. And as far as the targets listed in, or the projections listed in the ERP or the 45 economy-wide targets that the government had set out, it doesn't meet the mark and is not sufficient enough if we're looking to have a climate-safe world that keeps the temperatures to below 1.5 degrees.
I know that the oil and gas sector, though, says that even the targets laid out in the ERP are, they say, technically impossible, that there is no way that they can reach that by 2030, even though they do say they can reach net zero by 2050.
I see
Right.
that, sorry to interrupt, Ali. Did you want to speak to that? I see that Vanessa has also raised her hand and can maybe offer some advice here.
Yeah, I'll just, if you want, Vanessa, I'll just say that there are ways that the oil and gas industry can reduce emissions. There have been reports released where we're talking about, reductions in methane. We're talking about electrifying the grid. That does help the industry reduce the emissions. So not to get into a, counter for counter points that the industry might be using. We know the history of this industry that has, looked to delay and sort of fester doubt in any sort of plan. So I mean, we got to take that with a grain of salt. There is research out there on how this industry can meet these targets. And, we'd be more than happy to share that with you. And I'll just pass it to Vanessa because you had your hand up.
Sure, thank you.
Sure, thanks, Ali. I maybe just wanted to flag a report by Pembina. I will dig it up and put it in the chat if someone has access to it, in terms of how much the industry is actually capable of reducing emissions. And many of those are obviously near-term accessible emissions, for example, reducing methane. We've heard a lot, we continue to hear a lot about carbon capture, and we really need to be focusing on that short-term emissions to 2030, which is doable. We just need to be investing in the right things. The second thing I would note is that Pathways Alliance itself, while they have not released a detailed plan, has listed milestones by how much they want to reduce by megatons, and that actually does align fairly well with some of the less ambitious trajectories for the CAP. So there is a little bit of, on the one hand, they're saying they don't want the cap. And on the other hand, they have also said that they want to reach similar levels. So I think we just need to interrogate that in terms of understanding like what is actually possible for industry to do versus how much is them just not wanting to be regulated.
Yeah, okay, good point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, both of you. Amanda, did you have any other follow-ups or does anyone else want to take the floor?
I think that's good for me.
Great.
Yeah, I was wondering, Natasha Belowski, Canada's National Observer. In terms of like the peer review with Argentina, I haven't heard anything on that in a long time. I used to be asking some questions. Is there any update that you guys are aware of on the timeline for that? I know it's already, overdue, but.
Yeah, Vanessa or Émile?
Yeah, sorry, I was waiting for Émile, but I feel like maybe I'll just go for it. We don't have a date. However, we do know that the memo to cabinet is in progress. I don't know if it's actually been finalized yet in terms of the framework that Canada will be using to assess what constitutes a subsidy and what constitutes an inefficient subsidy. So we're waiting to hear a result from that. We had heard some intel that there may be an announcement at COP related to that, but I suspect that that timeframe is actually very too soon. And historically, they're announcing items on subsidies if there's not necessarily like a flagship moment at COP isn't necessarily the best moment. So we don't have a timeline for it, but we know that we have been assured by government that it is a priority for them to do that in the near term. I also do want to flag that what we are looking for at COP is an update on the government's implementation of the Glasgow Statement of International Public Finance. So it will have been a year since that commitment was made. And so we have yet to hear an update from that on government and what their implementation plan is. And that actually represents a substantial amount of money. So that's another piece to look for.
And just one follow-up on that, how influential will that Argentina peer review be? I haven't actually looked in depth at the other peer reviews that took place. So I'm just wondering how that may or may not inform, you know, what the government ultimately decides on its fossil fuel subsidy framework.
Yeah, excellent question. I think the peer review itself doesn't actually have binding, it creates recommendations, but it's not binding on governments to make action. I think the more important piece in the Canadian context is that it will have another country have reviewed it and that it's done within an international forum that's credible. And to the government's own commitment to eliminate inefficient subsidies by 2023, create some sort of transparency around what they're planning to do and establishes a framework of what they consider to be a subsidy. So obviously we'll be looking closely to see whether or not they take a sufficiently robust approach for that. But I think it, you know, completing it is a really important step to making sure they reach their domestic commitments.
Thanks so much, Vanessa and Natasha. Nous avons une prochaine question de Valérie Boisclair. Valérie, allez-y.
Yes, hi everyone, Valérie Boisclair from Radio-Canada. I'm going to switch to French. So my question would be for Caroline. Je me demandais, comme vous l'avez dit un peu plus tôt, que la COP27, ce sera une implementation COP. On parle beaucoup de cibles, mais il faut parler de mise en œuvre des plans pour y arriver. Bon, au Canada, le premier ministre nous dit qu'on va atteindre nos cibles, mais vous soulignez plutôt qu'on ignore encore comment. Donc, si vous pouviez me résumer les éléments, les indicateurs manquants, plutôt la précision qu'il faudrait impérativement avoir dans notre plan pour assurer une bonne mise en œuvre de nos cibles. Pardon.
Oui, merci pour la question. Donc, de plus de l'implantation et la conception rigoureuse, robuste et rapide des politiques nommées par mes co-panélistes, il y a certains éléments légaux qui manquent dans le plan de réduction des émissions pour 2030. Donc, le premier, ce sont des échéanciers clairs pour chacune des politiques. On s'attendait à voir dans le plan un peu qui fait quoi, quel ministre fait quelle politique, quel est son échéancier, combien de mégatonnes de réduction d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre on peut s'attendre et quel budget il sera alloué. On n'a pas ça même dans l'annexe d'implantation. Donc, des échéanciers clairs, c'est le premier élément. Le deuxième, c'est un lien fait de façon convaincante entre les politiques et l'objectif à long terme inscrit dans la loi, c'est-à-dire la trajectoire de réduction des émissions pour 2050. Donc, on a quelques liens ça et là dans le plan, mais ce n'est pas fait de façon convaincante. Et finalement, dans le plan, on voit la modélisation du gouvernement s'additionner jusqu'à une réduction de 36% sous les niveaux de 2005 d'ici 2030. Notre objectif, c'est une fourchette, ce qui est particulier, mais c'est quand même un minimum de 40%. Et donc, il y a des mesures manquantes. Ce sont 3 éléments à corriger, mais comme je le disais, l'atteinte ou non des objectifs va aussi vraiment se décider dans notre implantation. C'est pas sexy l'implantation, mais c'est crucial. And I'd really just like to maybe quickly add some thought to Amanda's last question. In addition to the excellent ideas of Vanessa and Ali, I'd like to say that we have to be really honest about the fact that while other sectors of the Canadian economy have been decreasing their emissions across the board, there is one sector that has not, and quite the contrary, has in fact increased them by 87% since 1990. So I think that's an additional element of the interrogation that Vanessa was mentioning that is important.
That's great, thank you.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Caro. Valérie, avez-vous des questions de suivi?
Non, merci, ça y répondait. Thanks.
Super, merci. opening it up to any other questions, especially if there's anyone who hasn't yet had a chance to ask. Please put your hand up. Or if there aren't, I'll just kind of going once, going twice. Then we can end this and let you go. As mentioned, I'll be sending up a follow-up email with contact information for all these smart, wonderful folks, and a link to the recording so you can share it with any colleagues who maybe didn't have a chance to come. For those of you who will be following COP27 closely, I'll send out the details as soon as we have them for that second part of the press briefing next week. I'll pass it, I think, back to Caro to give any closing words.
And thanks, Vicky. This is my kind of second closing word, so I don't have much to add other than we really appreciate your presence and attention to these sometimes very wonky issues. If there again, any last minute questions, we have 7 minutes left. These folks are hard to get together in the same virtual space. So really welcome. Any other questions? I'm seeing folks who haven't asked any, so don't be shy. I think we can maybe even kind of linger a little bit. So hoping to see you next week on our COP briefing. Thanks a lot.
Sounds good. Thanks, Caro. Well, then we can let folks trickle out and panelists and I can stay on for another minute or two in case anyone wants to have a bit more of a personalized chat. Oh, Chris, yeah, I see that you have a hand up. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering where we're at on public transit and electrification of buses and that kind of program. I remember hearing so much in a couple budgets ago about the federal funds that would be available, and I've sort of lost track of where it all stands.
Thanks, Chris. Great question. I imagine that Tom might want to speak to this and potentially also Émile and Caro. But Tom, if you want to take the first stab.
Yeah, so there's some groups who are specifically working on the electrification of school buses, so I'll let them speak to that. Émile, I'm hoping you can, because Équiterre is working on that. But it's an area, I mean, the government has announced some funding and whatnot, and we do see different transit authorities acquiring buses or announcing plans to do it. We're looking at various measures to put in the equivalent to a ZEV standard that would affect the medium and heavy duty, and also would up the federal government's targets for and policy interventions to ensure more electric school buses and transit buses are being used and whatnot. So it's still in play. There's a lot to be done there. But I don't know of any big updates at this point.
Émile, is your internet good enough that you're able to come in again? Or if not, Caro can maybe jump in.
It's better at the worst timing. I don't have much to add on what Tom said on electric school buses. As for public transportation as a whole, it's not my fault. So Équiterre works on this, but some other colleagues are working more closely on this file. So sorry, I don't have much to add to what Tom just said. We have a lot of recommendation on how to accelerate the electrification of vehicles, but also different modes of transportation. So active transportation, some electric bikes as well. We have rebates for electric vehicles as of now, but no rebates for electric bikes, which can be a great alternative for, let's say you have 2 cars in your driveways. Well, that can be a way of getting rid of one of them. But as for recent announcements on public transit, sorry, I just don't have the information with me.
Chris, we'll make sure to put you in touch with Nate. I see that Tom pasted his email in the chat, but Andriane as Équiterre as well. And I just want to do a little announcement. for your curiosity that CAN with our colleagues, many here are working on a climate investments report ahead of budget 2023, where we'll be doing that analysis on what has been spent on transit since 2016 and where are the gaps. Coming in at the beginning of 2023 though, so you'll have to be patient.
And perhaps just one last thing on transit is we're really recognizing that there's an issue with operational funding, especially COVID knocked out the ridership numbers, and we need to solve the issue of operational funding for transit authorities.
Thanks so much, all of you. Chris, did you have any other questions either on that subject or any others?
Well, of course, but.
Go for it then. We've got a couple minutes left still.
I would love like a round of anyone that wants to of what are they not doing that they could be doing? What are the top couple priorities where it's lagging?
That's a really good question. I see that Caro has unmuted, and after that, I'll maybe just call on folks in the order that you appear on my screen. So Caro, and then maybe Tom, I'll ask you to go next, if you can.
So I think that Canada, as we heard on Monday, really focuses its climate policy approach on carbon pricing. There's also a lot of regulation being developed right now, as we spent the hour discussing. One area that I think the Inflation Reduction Act really highlights Canada's inadequate responses in investment, public investment into climate action, right? How are we going to build all of this infrastructure that we need to get to a clean and safe economy? And so again, more detail coming on that in our climate investments report in 2023, where we'll be doing that analysis. But I know that the David Suzuki Foundation did a quick evaluation. And if we compare on a per capita basis, the Inflation Reduction Act spends 3 times more into climate investments than Canada did in the last budget. Obviously, it's kind of not necessarily an apples to apples comparison, but just as a benchmark. And so we're really hoping to see movements out of the border trigger this kind of, approach where we're transforming our economy and also creating political coalitions of support that are necessary to sustain climate action.
Thanks, Caro. Tom, did you want to follow up on that? And then I'll maybe throw it over to Binnu.
Sure. Well, I think the oil and gas emissions cap, making sure that's really effective and doesn't get watered down in the industry consultations and with lots of loopholes and offsets and all those kind of things, which could undermine it. And we saw that when the clean fuel regulations went through, so concerned about that not happening. There's such a higher opportunity in methane than governments following. And what we know is that the inventory vastly understates the emissions. And we're actually going to have an interesting piece coming out by the end of this month or mid-November, showing emissions in Alberta and Saskatchewan are very problematic. And I think accelerating the grid, as Binnu spoke to earlier, for deploying more renewables, decarbonizing it, and supporting electrification across Canada is such a big opportunity and one we should be moving much more quickly.
Maybe if I can just build off of that. The other thing I wanted to point out is actually the role of the provincial governments as well. We definitely need to push the federal government to do more. But a lot of the things we talked about today, the provincial governments actually have a lot of jurisdiction over some of these issues too, particularly the electricity work that I mentioned. Electricity is a provincial jurisdiction, so the feds can only take it so far. And we don't have that much time. We're talking about a net zero economy by 2050, a clean grid by 2035. That's only 13 years away. Most major infrastructure developments take about a decade to get done. And right now, we don't have a single province that has a net zero grid plan. And so I think that should be one of the high priorities, is for the provinces to come to the table with their plans for how are they investing, working with the feds, developing policies to make sure they're advancing all these sectors.
Great, thank you. I see that Émile has raised a hand. Émile, go for it.
Yeah, 2 points. The first one being on individual transportation. We have carrots, but there's no sticks. As of now, one tool that the government is not using is a fee-based system on cars. As of now, we have rebates for electric vehicles, but there's no price tag for the pollution of gas guzzling vehicles. So that's in the context of having limited spending from the government. That could be a way of having a revenue neutral program where the tax on the heavy emitting vehicles would pay for the rebate for the electric vehicle. So that can be a way, adding more sticks. And the other one, Vanessa already talked about it, but really having a great, well-designed just transition plan and strategy, act and strategy, is you can't stick any GHG reduction next to it, but it's part of all those other areas we're talking about. If the people think they're going to lose with the transition, they're not going to be behind transition that will be consequential and that will lead us to meet our targets, GHG reduction targets, and such on. So really having a well-designed just transition act, just transition strategy, involving the workers, involving the communities, involving the provincial, municipal, and indigenous governments in that transition, it will be an enabler for all those other policy areas. Because if people think they're going to lose, they're just not going to support having stronger climate policies.
Thanks, Émile. Ali and then Vanessa, do you want to finish it off?
Sure.
I just maybe just to check on to what Émile said. So one of the words we don't get here thrown around in Canada as much as we should is industrial strategy. And I think that's one of the key pieces that we're missing, that is separate to just transition, but highly related, interrelated. And so that part of that is understanding where our different economic sectors are going, and specifically our high carbon industries, and taking a more active approach like they are in the US in terms of what industries they're building up. So that's not necessarily a decarbonization piece, but in terms of planning the new economy, it's something that we want to be seeing more of, and creating those decent, good quality jobs and strong economic futures for communities.
And I'll just add, with the oil and gas, like Tom mentioned earlier, there's an opportunity to not let it be a diluted policy, right? Like there is a list of key principles that Climate Action and other organizations have developed to make sure that this policy is effective in what it's trying to do. So ideally, we would like to see, the government actually look at that and develop this policy with the intention that, okay, we're actually trying to do a managed decline away from fossil fuels rather than do a half step in, half step out, commit to net zero by 2050 or commit to X amount of reductions by 2030, and then continue to approve projects, fossil fuel projects or oil and gas projects, or continue to subsidize, technologies that ultimately end up having us rely more on fossil fuels. So ideally, in the ideal world, perfect world, the world that we're all trying to build towards, a world that's climate safe, these are the things that we would like to see the government, ultimately implement and continue working towards. I'll just leave it there.
Thanks so much. And I see that Tom has to leave us. So I think that this is probably a good note to end on. Thanks so much again to all the panelists for your really important insights. Obviously, there's a lot at stake this fall. And thanks to the reporters who've stuck around as we've gone over time, and to all the work that you do in holding government to account and analyzing this and translating it for the public. Thanks so much. I'm sure we'll be seeing you soon. Have a good evening.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Vicky.
Thanks so much.